The silence ended with one sentence, and it changed everything. After weeks of speculation, rumors, and unanswered questions, Teyana Taylor finally confirmed what no one expected. She was stepping into motherhood alone. No joint announcement. No shared photos. No carefully scripted statement, just truth. According to her, the news came after Aaron Pierre walked away. Not dramatically, not publicly, but decisively. And what followed wasn't chaos. It was reckoning. This wasn't a story about heartbreak. It wasn't about blame. It definitely wasn't about timing. It was about choice. Why did she wait to speak? What happened behind closed doors? And why did confirming this news feel more powerful than hiding it? Stay with us, because this isn't a celebrity update. It's a story about strength, silence, and choosing to move forward when life doesn't. Wait, the announcement didn't come with fanfare? No press conference, no coordinated rollout, no exclusive interview. It came quietly. And that's what made it thunderous. When Teyana Taylor confirmed her baby news, the internet froze for a moment. Not because of shock alone, but because of context. Everyone knew the silence that came before it. Everyone knew who was no longer standing beside her. And everyone knew this wasn't supposed to happen like this. According to Teyana, she didn't plan to share the news when she did. She had intended to keep things private for as long as possible. Not out of shame, but out of protection. Protection for herself. Protection for her future. Protection from narratives she already knew would follow. But silence once again began to do its own work. People speculated. People guessed. People assumed, and eventually the story started moving without her. She explained that confirming that news wasn't about feeding curiosity, was about stopping the story from being told incorrectly before it hardened into something she couldn't recognize. She chose timing over secrecy, and that choice reframed everything. The confirmation came shortly after Aaron Pierre exited her life. Not publicly, not with drama, just absence. A presence that was suddenly no longer there and never explained. From the outside, people assumed distance, career focus, mutual decisions. But according to Teyana, what happened was simpler and harder. Life moved forward faster than TAVE. If I moved forward faster than alignment. She described discovering the pregnancy as a moment that forced clarity. There was no room for indecision. No space for waiting on someone else's readiness. Just reality arriving without negotiation. She didn't describe panic. She didn't describe fear. Described stillness. The kind of stillness where everything becomes quiet enough to hear your own truth. According to her, the relationship with Aaron Pierre had already been fragile. Not broken, but uncertain. Conversations about the future existed, but they were open-ended. Flexible, delayed pregnancy. It doesn't allow delay. It demands response. She said the moment she shared the news privately, the shift was immediate. Not explosive distant. Conversations slowed. Certainty evaporated. Support became conditional. And then absence replaced effort. She didn't accuse him of cruelty. She didn't frame him as careless. She framed the moment as revealing, because moments like these don't create character. They expose it. According to Teyana, his decision to leave wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, which somehow made it heavier. Quiet exits don't give you something to argue with. They leave you alone with acceptance. And acceptance doesn't come quickly. She explained that for a while. She said nothing publicly because she was still processing privately. Processing what it meant to step into motherhood without the partnership she expected. Processing grief and gratitude at the same time because both existed. She said people often assume pregnancy announcements are joyful or tragic. Never both. But for her, it was layered. Excitement intertwined with loss. Strength built alongside vulnerability. And she refused to let that complexity be flattened into gossip. That's why when she finally confirmed the news, she didn't center the breakup. She centered herself. She spoke about responsibility, about readiness, about choosing not to disappear just because the situation didn't look perfect from the outside. She said something that resonated deeply. Life doesn't wait for comfort. And neither did she, according to Teyana, confirming the baby news. Wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about claiming ownership over a chapter that was already being written. She didn't want her child's story to begin with whispers. She wanted it to begin with truth. That decision alone reframed the narrative. Suddenly, the story wasn't about who left. It was about who stayed, who stepped up, who chose to move forward when plans changed. And in that moment, silence lost its grip. Because silence had no place in a story that was still being born. This wasn't an ending. It was a beginning, arriving in the middle of uncertainty. And what came next would challenge every assumption people thought they understood. After Aaron Pierre left, nothing collapsed the way people expected. There were no public scenes, no emotional posts, no visible fallout. Instead, there was quiet. According to Teyana Taylor, that quiet wasn't peaceful. It was disorienting. When someone exits without drama, there's no moment to react to, no argument to replay, no closure to negotiate. Just absence. She explained that the days immediately after his departure felt suspended in time. Life didn't stop, but it didn't move forward either. Conversations became practical instead of emotional. Decisions became urgent instead of shared, and urgency changes everything. She described how pregnancy has a way of stripping life down to essentials. There's no room for hypothetical futures. Everything becomes immediate, tangible, real. That reality hit fast. She said the first thing she noticed was how silence returned, not as protection, but as insulation. People around her didn't know what to say, so they said less. Support came in fragments. Encouragement arrived cautiously. Everyone was waiting to see how the story would be told, but Teyana wasn't ready to tell it yet. She explained that silence returned because she needed space to understand what had just happened. Not emotionally, structurally. What does life look like now? What decisions can't be postponed anymore? What expectations no longer apply? Those questions didn't come with easy answers. She said the hardest part wasn't being alone. It was recalibrating identity. The version of herself that imagined partnership had to be reimagined quickly. And that kind of adjustment doesn't happen overnight. She didn't blame Aaron Pierre publicly or privately. She acknowledged that people respond differently to unexpected responsibility. Some lean in, some step back. Neither response needs villainization to be impactful, but impact was there. She described moments when the silence felt louder than any argument ever could. When she realized she was making plans without consultation, decisions without discussion, preparations without reassurance, and that's when silence stopped being neutral again, according to Teyana. There was an assumption from the outside that she was being strong. That label followed her everywhere. Strong, resilient, unbetaught. But strength, she said, can be misleading. Strength can look like holding everything together. While quietly unraveling inside, she talked about the loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from being misunderstood. People assumed she was okay because she wasn't visibly breaking down. But composure isn't the same as certainty. She wasn't certain yet. She was adjusting. She explained that. After Aaron Pierre left, communication didn't end. It changed. It became careful, measured, limited to logistics and distance. Emotional conversations felt postponed indefinitely, and postponement has consequences. She said there's a difference between choosing silence and being left in it. One feels controlled, the other feels imposed. This time, silence wasn't hers. That distinction mattered, according to Teyana. She spent nights thinking about what she wanted her child to inherit emotionally. Not just stability, but honesty, presence, grounding, she asked herself. Difficult questions. What does strength look like when no one is watching? What does independence look like when it's not a choice, but a necessity. What kind of story do I want this beginning to be? Those questions reshaped her perspective. She realized that waiting for things to return to how they were wasn't realistic. Life had already moved forward. The only option was to move with it consciously. That realization brought resolve. She said the silence after he left wasn't empty, it was instructive. It showed her what support looked like when expectations disappeared. It clarified who leaned in and who leaned out, and clarity even when painful. It's grounding. According to Teyana, this period forced her to stop framing the situation as temporary. There was no until, no pause, just a new reality forming, day by day. That's when she began preparing emotionally for motherhood. Not as a shared journey, but as a personal one. She didn't frame that preparation as loss. She framed it as ownership, as ownership. Ownership of decisions, ownership of space. Ownership of the narrative. She said that while silence initially felt heavy, it eventually became purposeful. It allowed her to center herself without external influence, to hear her own instincts clearly. But silence couldn't last forever because silence leaves too much room for assumption, and assumptions were already starting to surface. She noticed subtle shifts online, conversations hinting, speculation building, narratives forming around timelines and motives she never discussed. That's when she realized something. It's important. Staying silent now wouldn't protect her child's story. It would let others write it, and that was something she wasn't willing to allow. So while she remained quiet publicly, internally, she was preparing. Not for confrontation, but for truthful presence. She didn't plan a reveal. She didn't script an explanation. She prepared herself to stand firmly in what was happening without apology, because sometimes confirmation isn't about making an announcement. It's about refusing to hide, and when she eventually chose to confirm the baby news, it wasn't a reaction to pressure. It was a decision made in clarity, a clarity shaped by silence, solitude, and the understanding that life doesn't wait for ideal conditions, it moves forward and asks you to move with it. When Teyana Taylor finally confirmed the baby news, many people thought it was reactive, according to her. It was the opposite. It was deliberate. She explained that by the time she spoke, the decision had already been made internally weeks earlier. Not about motherhood, that part was never in question, but about ownership. Ownership of timing, ownership of narrative, ownership of what would and wouldn't be said about her life. Silence had given her clarity, but clarity without control is fragile. She described watching speculation grow quietly online. Nothing explicit, nothing reckless, just enough hints, guesses, and coded language to let her know the story was starting to move without her again. She recognized the pattern immediately. First comes curiosity, then interpretation, then assumption, then certainty. And once certainty sets in, reversing it becomes nearly impossible. She didn't want the most important chapter of her life to be filtered through guesswork, so she chose to speak, not to explain everything, but to anchor reality. She emphasized that confirmation is a powerful act. It doesn't answer every question, simply establishes one thing as true, forcing every other narrative to orbit around it. By confirming the baby news herself, she reclaimed the center of the story. She wasn't responding to rumors. She wasn't defending decisions. She was setting a boundary. This is what's happening. This is where I am. Everything else is noise. According to Teyana, that boundary mattered more than people realized. Without it, the conversation would have continued drifting, timelines debated, motives assigned, relationships dissected. Confirmation stopped that drift. It didn't end discussion, but it changed its direction. She described how the moment the news was confirmed, the tone shifted. Speculation slowed. Whispers hardened into acknowledgement. People stopped guessing and started reacting. And reaction, she said, is easier to handle than interpretation. Because interpretation happens without you. Reaction happens to something you've already claimed. She also spoke about why she didn't wait longer. Some people assumed she rushed. Others assumed she was pressured. According to Teyana, neither was true. She said there's a point where privacy stops serving you and starts serving confusion. That point arrives quietly, but unmistakably. She knew she had reached it. She described feeling the shift internally. A sense that holding the news privately was no longer protective. It was restrictive. It forced her to navigate public spaces cautiously, conversations carefully, moments partially. She didn't want her pregnancy to feel like a secret she was managing. She wanted it to feel like a reality she was living. She also addressed the assumption that confirming the news was meant to send a message to Aaron Pierre. She rejected that idea completely. This wasn't communication. It wasn't retaliation. Wasn't leverage. It was independence. According to Teyana, life events like this demand clarity, not negotiation. And once it became clear that this chapter would be navigated independently, she saw no reason to hide it. She didn't want motherhood to begin in silence, shaped by absence. She wanted it to begin in truth, shaped by presence, her presence. She explained that control doesn't mean controlling reactions. It means controlling intent. She couldn't manage how people would respond, but she could decide why she spoke. And her reason was simple. She didn't want her child's story to start with secrecy. She described thinking about the future, about explaining this moment someday, about wanting to say, "I didn't hide you. I stood firmly in what was happening, even when it was uncomfortable." That thought grounded her. She said confirmation wasn't a cry for support. It was an affirmation of readiness. Readiness to move forward without waiting for alignment that wasn't coming. She also acknowledged that confirmation invited scrutiny. Questions she wasn't prepared to answer. Opinions she didn't ask for. But scrutiny was easier than invisibility, because invisibility removes agency. Scrutiny still recognizes presence. She framed this decision as one of the most self-directed moments of her life. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. She didn't curate emotion. She didn't soften reality. She didn't ask permission. She simply stated truth. And in doing so, she shifted power back into her hands. According to Teyana, that shift changed how she experienced everything that followed. Appointments, planning, conversations. Even quiet moments felt different once the truth was no longer hidden. She said secrecy had made everything feel tentative. Confirmation made it real. And reality, even when complicated, is grounding. She also spoke about how confirming the news reframed the absence of calm self. Aaron Pierre. Instead of being the central question, it became context important, but not defining. The story stopped being about who left it, became about who stayed. Present. And that reframing was intentional. She wanted to move forward without constantly explaining what didn't happen. She wanted focus on what was happening. Growth, preparation, transition. Confirmation allowed that. It drew a line between speculation and fact. And once that line was drawn, everything else became secondary. This wasn't about shock value. It wasn't about headlines. It wasn't about reclaiming attention. It was about reclaiming ground, standing firmly in reality instead of tiptoeing around it. And from that position, the rest of the story could finally unfold honestly. Because once truth is acknowledged, silence loses its grip. And what came next wasn't reaction, it was resolve. Once Teyana Taylor confirmed the baby news, something irreversible happened. The narrative stopped floating. It landed for weeks. The story had existed in fragments, whispers, guesses, half-statements, coded language. But confirmation has gravity. It pulls everything into focus, whether people are ready or not. According to Teyana, the reaction wasn't explosive. It was layered. Support poured in. Questions followed. Judgment crept in quietly. And underneath it all was something more subtle. Recalibration. She described how the public didn't just react to the news. They reinterpreted everything that came before it. Old photos, past interviews, moments once dismissed as normal suddenly felt intentional. This is what happens when context changes. People don't just update information, they rewrite meaning. She explained that the silence she had kept earlier was now being reread through a different lens. What once looked like privacy now looked like concealment. What looked like calm now looked like preparation. And she understood why. Confirmation doesn't just reveal truth. It reorganizes memory. According to Teyana, this was the moment she realized how little control anyone truly has once a story enters the public arena. Even when you speak clearly, interpretation takes over. But there was a difference. It's time she was no longer invisible in the story. She had spoken, and that alone changed the power dynamic. She noticed how quickly people stopped asking if something was happening and started asking how she would handle it. The focus shifted from speculation to expectation. That shift mattered. Expectation implies acknowledgement. Speculation implies dismissal. She said that even criticism felt different now, not lighter, but clearer. People weren't guessing anymore. They were responding to something real and reality. Even when uncomfortable is easier to stand in. Then rumor. She also spoke about how the confirmation reframed the absence of Aaron Pierre in the public eye. His silence, once unremarkable, became noticeable. Not accusatory, just visible. Silence always changes meaning when context changes. Before confirmation, his absence blended into ambiguity. After confirmation, it became a fact people registered. Without commentary. She didn't draw attention to it. She didn't need to. Truth does that on its own. According to Teyana, one of the most surprising outcomes was how the confirmation slowed things down. Instead of accelerating chaos, it reduced it. Conversations became more grounded. The speculation lost urgency because there was no longer a mystery to chase. She explained that mystery fuels obsession. Clarity redirects it. People may not like the clarity, but they stop inventing alternatives. That gave her breathing room. She described how confirmation allowed her to exist publicly without constant vigilance. She didn't have to hide timing. She didn't have to deflect questions with silence. She didn't have to manage TW. She said the difference now was choice. Before, silence forced her to absorb everything quietly. Now, speaking allowed her to decide what mattered and what didn't. She didn't respond to every opinion. She didn't clarify every assumption. She didn't defend every decision because she no longer felt obligated to. According to Teyana, confirmation gave her permission to disengage selectively. She could be present without being exposed, honest without being exhaustive. That balance was new, empowering. She described how the narrative stopped being about surprise and started being about resilience. Not resilience as performance, but resilience as continuation. Life didn't pause for public reaction. Appointments still happened. Plans still needed to be made, and those practical realities grounded her more than any commentary ever could. She emphasized that public perception is fleeting, but lived experience is constant. Once she internalized that, the noise lost its volume. She also spoke about how the confirmation forced people to confront their own assumptions. Many expected collapse, drama, emotional unraveling. Instead, they saw steadiness, not because things were easy, but because she chose not to dramatize complexity. She said something that stayed with her. People expected a story. I was living a life. That distinction mattered. According to Teyana, confirmation didn't close the chapter. It opened a new one that required less explanation and more presence. She didn't owe the public comfort. She didn't owe them answers. She owed herself honesty, and honesty had already been delivered. She framed this moment as the point where the story stopped being speculative content and became a lived transition. From partnership to independence, from shared expectations to personal responsibility, from silence to intentional visibility, she knew the conversation would continue. Stories like this always do, but now the conversation would orbit around something real, not imagined, and that alone changed everything. Because once truth is named, it doesn't disappear, it becomes the foundation. And from that foundation, the final transformation could finally begin. After the confirmation, the noise eventually softened. But according to Teyana Taylor, what followed wasn't relief. It was reckoning. Because once the world knew, there was nothing left to hide behind. No protective silence, no strategic distance. Just reality, unfolding day by day. She explained that the emotional cost didn't arrive all at once. It came in waves, unpredictable, uneven, impossible to schedule around. Some days felt grounded. Others felt heavy for no obvious reason, and that unpredictability was the hardest part. She said people often assume clarity brings peace. But clarity also brings responsibility. Once you acknowledge where you are, can't pretend not to see what's required of you next. And what was required now was everything. She described moments when strength felt performative, not because she wanted it to be, but because others expected it. People praised her resilience constantly, but rarely asked how much it was costing her. Resilience, she said, is often misunderstood. It doesn't mean you're unaffected. It means you're continuing anyway. And continuing takes energy, according to Teyana. The emotional weight came from holding multiple truths at once. Gratitude for what was growing inside her. Grief for what didn't survive alongside it. Confidence in her choice. Sadness about how things unfolded. All of those feelings existed together, and none of them canceled each other out. She said the most isolating part wasn't being alone. It was feeling like complexity made others uncomfortable. People wanted a clean story, either empowerment or heartbreak. But real life rarely fits into one category. She spoke about nights when the future felt overwhelming, not frightening, just vast. So many decisions ahead, so many unknowns, so much responsibility now resting solely with her. She didn't doubt her capability. She felt the weight of sole ownership. There's a difference. She explained that emotionally. The absence of AARONPIE showed up in unexpected ways. Not in daily logistics, she adapted quickly, but in moments where partnership would have softened the load. Appointments where questions were directed only at her. Decisions where consensus didn't exist. Moments that highlighted contrast rather than conflict. Those moments didn't provoke anger. They provoked awareness. Awareness that this chapter would require deeper self-trust than anything before it. According to Teyana, there were days when the emotional cost manifested physically, fatigue that sleep didn't fix, heaviness that didn't have a name. Not depression, not fear, just emotional saturation. She said silence had prepared her for solitude, but it hadn't prepared her for exposure. Once the world knew, she had to learn how to protect her emotional space in a different way, not by hiding, but by filtering. She became intentional about who had access to her energy, who she explained things to, who she let close. Boundaries became non-negotiable. And boundaries, she realized, are expensive at first. They cost relationships. They cost convenience. They cost comfort. But they save you later. She described learning to sit with uncertainty instead of rushing to resolve it. Learning that not every feeling needed immediate clarity. Some just needed acknowledgement. She stopped asking herself whether things would have been easier if he stayed. That question no longer served her. Instead, she asked different ones. What does stability look like now? What does support mean now? What kind of emotional environment am I creating? Those questions shifted her focus from loss to construction, according to Teyana. The emotional cost also included mourning expectations she didn't realize she still had. Not of him, but of how she thought this chapter would begin. Letting go of imagined versions of life is painful, even when the reality you're stepping into is meaningful. She allowed herself to grieve that quietly, without apology. She emphasized that strength doesn't mean bypassing grief. It means letting it exist without letting it decide everything. She also spoke about moments of joy that surprised her, moments that felt pure, unburdened by circumstance, moments where excitement surfaced unexpectedly. Those moments reminded her that emotional cost isn't the same as emotional depletion. She wasn't empty, she was expanding, and expansion is uncomfortable. She said the most important lesson during this phase was learning not to narrate her emotions for others. Not everything needed to be shared. Not every feeling needed validation. Some things needed privacy again, but this time, chosen privacy, not imposed silence. She reframed privacy as sovereignty. According to Teyana, the emotional cost of this chapter didn't break her. It refined her. It stripped away illusions and replaced them with grounded resolve. She stopped waiting for emotional closure from the past. Closure, she realized, was something she could give herself by accepting what was, by releasing what wasn't, by committing to what comes next. This wasn't about becoming hardened. It was about becoming anchored. Anchored in truth. Anchored in responsibility. Anchored in self-trust. And that anchoring prepared her for the final transformation, the part of the story people rarely see, but always feel. Because once the emotional cost is paid, something shifts. Not outwardly, inwardly, and that shift would define everything that followed. By the time Teyana Taylor reached this point, one thing was clear to her. This story was never about abandonment. It was about arrival into a version of herself that didn't depend on alignment, reassurance, or shared readiness. A version shaped by reality instead of expectation. She explained that when people look back at this chapter, they'll likely focus on the moment Aaron Pierre left. They'll frame it as the turning point, the fracture, the before and after. But from her perspective, that moment wasn't the center, it was the backdrop. The real transformation happened quietly after the headlines faded. After the conversation slowed, after the confirmation became old news. It happened in the day-to-day. Decisions no one watched. She said that motherhood forced a shift she could no longer delay. Every choice now carried weight. Not symbolic weight, real consequences. And that responsibility clarified things faster than time ever could. She stopped asking herself who stayed and who didn't. She started asking, what kind of environment? She was creating because environment shapes outcomes, according to Teyana. The absence that once felt defining slowly became contextual. Important, yes, but no longer central. Her focus moved from loss to structure, from reaction to intention. That's when she realized something fundamental. When your life expands, old narratives lose relevance. She described how her identity shifted from being relational to being directional. Instead of defining herself by who was beside her, she defined herself by where she was going. That shift changed everything. She no longer measured progress by emotional closure. She measured it by stability, by peace, by consistency. She spoke about how independence stopped feeling like something she had to prove. It became something she simply lived, not defiantly, not performatively, naturally. She emphasized that this chapter didn't harden her. It centered her. She learned that strength doesn't come from enduring quietly forever. It comes from choosing clarity when endurance starts costing too much. And she had reached that point. According to Teyana, the most powerful part of this journey wasn't the announcement. It wasn't the confirmation. Wasn't even the decision to speak. It was the moment she stopped waiting for circumstances to feel ideal before moving forward. Because life rarely offers ideal timing. It offers